The first sound was not a bark, but the heavy, uneven rhythm of hooves scraping against packed earth. Dusk was falling over the paddocks, that soft hour when shadows stretched long and the wind seemed to hush, as if waiting for something to unfold. From the tree line, the figure of a horse appeared, its gait broken, its body sagging beneath invisible weight. Each step was hesitant, as though the ground itself threatened to give way. Dust rose behind it in faint clouds, catching the last threads of amber light, and there, pacing close and low to the ground, moved a German shepherd with her ears pinned back, her body taut with intent. She was not herding, not guarding, not chasing, she was guiding. Every few paces she stopped, turned her head, and let out a short, urging sound. The horse, a gelding with ribs faintly visible beneath his coat, lifted his head in response, eyes clouded with both pain and stubborn endurance. There was no rider, no halter, no human hand, just the strange, silent agreement between two creatures, bound together by some urgency unseen. Near the stable door, an old man watched his figure hunched against the evening chill. He had been mending a broken latch when he first noticed the dog vanish into the pasture earlier, her body drawn tight, as if sensing something no human eye could trace. Now, he leaned heavily on the wooden post, caught between AW and dread as the pair drew closer. The shepherd's fur was streaked with burrs, her flank rising and falling too fast. But her eyes never wavered from the horse. The old man knew this dog. He had seen her fight shadows, circle empty barns, lie awake under storms as if haunted by ghosts no one else could feel. And now she was leading back something he had not expected to see return. The horse's limp worsened with each step, a dragging rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the land itself. The shepherd pressed against his side, steadying him, her body small but insistent, like a lantern against the dark. A flock of crows lifted suddenly from the far field, their calls sharp and unsettled, but neither animal flinched. The air carried a smell of damp earth and sweat, the kind that spoke of struggle and long miles endured. The old man swallowed, a question rising in him that he dared not shape into words. What had happened out there, and why had the dog alone returned to lead the horse home? Silence fell as they reached the threshold of the stable. The gelding halted, head drooping, breath rattling, and the shepherd pressed her muzzle to his shoulder with a quiet persistence, as though she would not allow him to stop. The man stepped forward, but the weight of the moment rooted him in place. He had seen storms tear roofs from barns, seen calves dragged away by coyotes, but he had never seen this animal bearing another back from the edge, driven not by command but by some private vow of loyalty. The shepherd turned then, eyes flashing briefly toward him, not in greeting but in something closer to accusation, or perhaps plea. For an instant he felt stripped of the comfort of knowing his place in this land, as if the animals had written a story in which he was only a spectator. The night deepened, the stable creaked, and the horse gave a shuddering sigh that sounded too much like surrender. In that suspended the stable door sagged slightly in its frame, groaning as the wind pressed against it. The German shepherd stood, unmoving, her body taut with urgency, her eyes fixed on the old man as though she were waiting for his judgment. The gelding shivered beside her, muscles twitching beneath a sweat-darkened coat, his breath coming in short bursts that misted faintly. In the cooling night air, the silence stretched unbearably, broken only by the restless creak of timbers and the horse's ragged exhale. For a moment, it felt as if none of them dared to move, as if even a step too soon might shatter something fragile and irretrievable. The man's hand finally lifted, slow and uncertain, reaching not for the horse but for the latch he had abandoned. Earlier he forced the door wider, its iron hinges protesting, and the stale scent of hay and leather drifted outward. The gelding's ears flicked back, hesitant, but the shepherd nudged his shoulder again, insistent, almost fierce. Her growl was low, not meant to threaten but to command, as though she carried a responsibility far heavier than her frame. The man noticed the burrs stuck in her fur, the faint trace of dried blood on one paw, and a thought struck him. This Doug had not simply found the horse. She had fought to bring him back. Inside, the stable smelled of old straw and dust, layered with the faint metallic temps of past winters. The gelding's hooves scraped against the threshold as he stumbled in, the limp dragging more heavily now. Each faltering step seemed to pull him further into exhaustion. The shepherd shadowed his side, her breathing sharp, her eyes brightened, the dim light filtering through the gaps in the wall. The man followed them, though unease pressed into his chest like a stone. He could not shake the feeling that something unseen hovered just beyond reach. Some story written in the horse's wounds and the dog's urgency, one that refused to reveal itself too soon. When the horse finally stopped in the half-dark, the shepherd sat abruptly before him, her body rigid, ears tilted not toward the gelding but outward, listening. The man felt it then, too. The wind outside had shifted, carrying with it a faint sour scent. Not the smell of rain, nor the musk of fox or deer, but something wilder, older, threaded with threat. The shepherd's fur bristled along her spine. Her loyalty had not ended at guiding the horse back. She was guarding against whatever might follow. The gelding lowered his head, trembling, a long sigh rattling free from his chest. His body leaned heavily against the wooden beam, and for a The moment the man feared he would collapse, he stepped forward, reaching at last to steady him, and his hand brushed against the gelding's shoulder where the skin was raw, ridged with swelling, not a clean cut, not a simple stumble. The flesh told of something harsher, something torn and unfinished. His throat tightened. Out there in the fields, among the trees, the horse had been driven, perhaps hunted, and yet only the dog had brought him home. The shepherd rose again, circling once, then settling near the stable's open door, her gaze fixed outward into the deepening dark. She did not relax. She did not soften. Every muscle told of unfinished work. The man, kneeling now by the gelding, felt an old ache stir in his chest, an ache born not only of pity for the animal but of recognition. He too had known what it meant to be driven, to stumble home bloodied and incomplete, carried only by the stubbornness of another's will. His hand lingered against the horse's trembling neck, but his eyes stayed on the dog, and in that silence, he understood. She feared the night had not yet yielded its full account. A sudden gust rattled the roof slats, scattering loose straw across the dirt floor. The gelding flinched weakly, and the shepherd stood at once, her ears cutting the air, her eyes fierce in the dim light. The man followed her gaze, though the night offered him nothing but shifting shadows and the whisper of leaves. Yet he knew, with the weight of certainty that settles only in older bones, that this silence was not empty. Something moved beyond it, something that explained the horse's limp, the dog's spurs-nagged coat, the scent carried on the wind, and then, faint but undeniable, came the sound, a snap of branches, deliberate and close, like the first note of a truth none of them were ready to face. The air inside the stable was heavy, layered with the smell of hay and sweat, the silence so dense it felt as if the rafters themselves were holding their breath. The horse's sides trembled with each ragged inhale, his frame quivering as though the strength that had carried him this far might dissolve at any second. The German shepherd stood close against him, her chest heaving, eyes sharp, as if she alone refused to surrender to the stillness that threatened to smother the room. The old man, caught in the shadows of the doorway, could not step forward. Something in the dog's gaze pinned him where he stood, an unspoken demand that he reckon with what she had brought back. The gelding shifted, one foreleg dragging, with an almost unbearable weight, and the sound of his hoof scraping against the wooden floorboards rang louder than it should have, raw and unsettling. The shepherd flinched, but pressed herself tighter against his side, urging him inward. The horse obeyed, each step deliberate, as though guided by a tether that existed only in the quiet bond between them. Above, the wind pressed against the roof, loose boards, groaning like an old memory rising at the wrong time. The old man finally moved. His boots struck the ground softly, but each step felt like trespass. He had known this horse in strength, in speed, had seen him lift his head high against the morning sun, but never like this hollow-eyed ribs showing, body faltering beneath a burden invisible to human eyes. He reached out, his hand hovering, just short of contact, and for the first time in years he hesitated. The gelding's ears twitched back, a subtle recoil, and the shepherd's low growl followed, not hostile but protective, as though she sensed the horse was not ready to trust even familiar hands. A long moment passed, broken only by the soft stir of hay under shifting hooves. Then the old man noticed what the dim light had concealed. Along the gelding's flank ran a dark line, half hidden by mud and dust, the kind of wound that spoke of more than accident. His breath caught, his throat tight with the weight of questions he could not yet ask. Had the animal fallen, been struck, or had something else unseen in the fields pressed its mark upon him? He glanced to the shepherd, as if she might offer the answer. Her eyes held steady, unblinking, demanding that he see without words what she had already understood. The gelding lowered his head to the hay, but instead of eating, he exhaled in a long, shuddering sigh. It was the sound of surrender, of something giving way inside, and the man felt a chill run beneath his skin. He knew enough of animals to understand this moment, when the body wavers between holding on and letting go. The shepherd seemed to know it too. She moved to his shoulder, rested, her muzzle against him, her breath stirring the dampness of his coat. There was no noise, no urgency, only the quiet persistence of presence, as though she believed her nearness alone might anchor him here. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped away. A line of cold wind threaded through the gaps in the boards, brushing past them all, carrying with it the faint rustle of distant leaves. The old man closed his eyes briefly. He remembered nights like this, long ago, when another horse had staggered into his care, and how he had failed then, too slow to notice, too proud to listen. That failure had sat inside him for years like a buried stone. Now, standing before these two creatures, the loyal shepherd and the broken gelding, he felt that stone shift, grinding against old grief, demanding to be faced. The shepherd's ears flicked suddenly. She stiffened, head lifting, eyes narrowing toward the open doorway. The man followed her gaze. Beyond the frame of the stable, the night stretched wide and dark, filled with nothing but the murmur of wind over the fields. Yet there was something in the air, a presence, or perhaps just the suggestion of one, that unsettled the stillness. The gelding shivered, a ripple running the length of his body, and the shepherd let out a low, almost inaudible sound, not warning, not comfort, something between. The old man stood frozen, his breath shallow, his hand still hovering above the horse's scarred flank. He felt the weight of choice pressing against him, as if this moment were balanced on the edge of decision. And just as he tried to steady himself, a faint noise carried in on the wind, distant, uneven, impossible to place. It was not the call of crows, nor the cry of any animal he knew. It was something else, threading through the dark like a reminder that what had led the horse to this broken state had not been left behind in the fields. The shepherd's head turned sharply, ears straining, body poised. The gelding's breath quickened, nostrils flaring with fear that needed no explanation. The man's heart thudded, caught between memory and the present. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The stable fell into silence once more, but the silence was no longer empty. It carried with it the weight of a question that could not yet be answered. The horse's sigh lingered in the air, ragged and uneven, and the silence that followed seemed almost deliberate, as though the night itself withheld its breath. The German shepherd did not retreat from his side. Instead, she leaned closer, her muzzle pressed against the gelding's trembling shoulder, her paws braced as if holding him to the earth. The old man, standing at the stable door, felt the weight of her gaze again. It was neither command nor request. It was something older, harder, a silent demand that left him uncertain whether he was being judged or summoned. A gust of wind crept through the yard, lifting dust in small spirals and rattling the stable boards with a hollow sound. The gelding's legs wavered, his knees threatening to fold, but the shepherd shifted quickly, pressing her body against his chest to keep him upright. It was a desperate gesture, almost human in its intensity. The old man stepped forward then, though his boots dragged against the earth, slowed not by age alone but by a hesitation he could not name. The horse had left this pasture broken once before, led away by men who promised recovery and returned only silence. To see him here again, torn and faltering, made the old man feel as if time itself had rewound, carrying its griefs with it. The shepherd growled, low and throaty, when he came too close, not out of threat, but warning. Do not rush, do not frighten him. The sound unsettled the night birds. A lone owl shifted its wings above the stable roof, feathers brushing the air with a dry hiss. The man paused. He had handled cattle all his life, mended fences, buried animals he had raised from birth. But never before had he been asked to stand back, to let a dog dictate the pace of mercy. He lowered his eyes, ashamed of the impulse to force the moment into his own rhythm. The gelding raised his head then, a trembling effort, his breath clouding the cool air. His eyes sought the shepherd first, not the man, and for a long moment, the dog met his gaze with a stillness that seemed to speak louder than any voice. Then, with a sudden tremor, the horse lurched forward, one heavy step into the stable's shadow. The shepherd followed close at his flank, nudging, urging, her claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and old straw, the remembered comfort of shelter. But there was another scent too darker, metallic, a trace of blood that clung to the horse's leg. The old man saw it then, in the dim light that bled through the cracks of the stable boards, a gash deep across the gelding's hindquarter, raw and wet, too clean to be a stumble against rock, too precise to be the work of thorns. Something, or someone, had cut him. The realization stiffened his back, sent his hand tightening around the lantern he carried. He wanted to curse, to rage, but the words knotted inside him, choked by the solemnity of the moment. The shepherd had stopped near the wound, her nose brushing the torn flesh with a caution that bordered on reverence. She did not whine or cry. Instead, she sat back on her haunches and looked at the man, her body angled toward the horse but her eyes locking on him. It was not an appeal for help, it was a demand for truth. He stepped closer at last, setting the lantern down on a bale, its light flickering across the stall. The shadows stretched long and jagged, as if the walls themselves were bending under the weight of what had been revealed. His fingers hovered just above the gelding's flank, close enough to feel the heat radiating from the wound, but he did not touch. He feared what the contact would confirm, not the depth of the injury, but the intention behind it. Outside, the wind rose sharply, rattling the loose tin of the roof, and somewhere beyond the pasture a distant sound carried on the air. It was faint, uncertain, but unmistakably human, a voice, low and broken, drifting like an echo through the dark. The gelding flinched, his body tightening, and the shepherd's ears pricked forward, alert and rigid. She gave no sound this time, only a slow, deliberate shift of her weight toward the door, as though she already knew the direction from which that voice had come. The old man stood frozen, lantern light trembling on his weathered hands. The night was no longer empty. It held within it a question too heavy to bear. Who had marked the horse, and why had the dog chosen now to bring him back? The stable seemed suddenly smaller, the air tighter, as if the truth itself pressed against the walls, waiting to be let in. And then the voice came again, clearer, closer, call that seemed to know its way through the darkness. The shepherd rose, hackles, lifting, and fixed her gaze on the door. The second call drifted closer, steady now, no longer a broken echo but a voice seeking recognition. The German shepherd stood taut at the doorway, her frame rigid against the lamplight, as if deciding whether to move toward it or bar its entrance. The gelding shifted uneasily in the stall, ears flicking, the whites of his eyes showing for the briefest moment before he lowered his head, exhausted. The old man felt the air thicken around him, each breath heavier than the last, and in that suspended quiet he knew the voice belonged not to a stranger, but to someone who had been here before. From the darkness outside a figure appeared as half hidden by the night. The shepherd let out a low sound, not a growl but a warning note, sharp enough to still the approach. The man who stepped into view was gaunt, his shoulders sloped with defeat, his hands trembling at his sides. His eyes avoided the dog, avoided the horse, and finally lifted only to meet the old man's stare. For a moment, no words passed between them. It was the gelding who broke the silence, a faint nicker that carried both pain and recognition. The old man understood. The wound was not the work of wild chance. It was born of human desperation, of someone who had once held the reins too tightly and lost his way in the weight of his own failures. The horse had fled, the shepherd had followed, and now against instinct, against reason she had brought them both back. Not for forgiveness, perhaps, but for truth. The younger man sank to his knees just inside the threshold, his voice trembling as he whispered something too soft to catch. The shepherd did not advance, but her ears shifted back, and her body eased, just enough to allow the horse to lower his head toward the sound. The old man did not interfere. He had lived long enough to know that some reckonings could not be bridged by words, only by presence. The lantern flame sputtered, its light casting long shadows across the stall, stretching and curling like memories, too stubborn to fade. The gelding's eyes softened, his breath shallow but steadying as he leaned into the shepherd's side once more. The dog did not look at either man. Her gaze was fixed outward, through the crack of the door, as if marking the darkness beyond. She had led them to this moment, but she did not claim it. She was guardian, witness, and reminder. Outside the wind had calmed, the fields lay quiet, the grasses bending only slightly under the weight of night. The crows had vanished, and the owl no longer shifted its wings. Even the sky seemed to hold still, the stars sharp and watchful above the barn roof. It was as if the land itself acknowledged the cost of what had been carried back and laid bare within its walls. The old man set a hand on the stable door, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingers, and with a slow breath he stepped inside. He moved to the gelding's side at last, his touch gentle on the horse's neck. The shepherd did not protest this time. She turned her head, eyes meeting his, and in that quiet exchange he read something closer to acceptance than judgment. The horse, though wounded, had found his way back. The man who had hurt him had come to, and perhaps that was enough. An imperfect circle, closed not with triumph but with fragile dignity. The lantern's light dimmed, leaving more shadow than glow. The younger man remained on his knees, silent, while the gelding exhaled a long, weary breath and settled into the straw. The shepherd lay down beside him, her body pressed close, her eyes half-lidded but unyielding in their watch. The old man lowered himself onto a stool in the corner, his bones heavy, his heart heavier still. None of them spoke, none of them moved, to disturb the fragile stillness. When at last the flame died, only the faint glow of moonlight remained, slipping through the cracks in pale slivers. It caught on the gelding's flank, on the shepherd's steady frame, on the dust suspended in the quiet air. Beyond the stable, the night stretched endless and deep, but within those wooden walls there was a strange kind of peace bitter in its truth, yet steady enough to endure. The shepherd closed her eyes then, not in sleep but in rest, her body still pressed against the horse as if to hold him anchored. The old man leaned back, letting the silence settle like earth over roots, and in the fading stillness he understood. Loyalty is not without cost, and return is not the same as healing, but both carry their own kind of grace. Outside, the wind stirred once more, lifting a single trail of dust that drifted across the threshold and disappeared into the night. The sound of it was soft, almost tender, like the echo of a promise kept.